Okay, this week might be a little different than usual. Not that the content or anything is different, just that as I was learning this, each Gemara led me to another Gemara, It felt like it was spiraling out of control. So rather than having kind of a concise, relatively thought out beginning and end to the shiur, we'll probably just be learning some Gemaras. And then maybe some commentaries if we have time, and then maybe after leave it open for some discussion because we'll try to wrap everything up at the end, but there's a lot going on here. There's a few different Gemaras that we'll learn that each touch on the same core concept, but each have kind of slightly different takes. But I think it's worth looking at all of them and trying to understand how they relate to each other. So we're in Avodah Zarah, and there's a Gemara on Daf Daled Amud Aleph that says as follows: Amar Rav Abba bar Kahana, Mai dichtiv Chalila lecha me'asot kadavar hazeh la'amid tzadikim rasha. So when Avram is arguing with God about Sodom, trying to save the city, so Avram says to God, Chalila lecha me'asot kadavar hazeh la'amid tzadikim rasha. Chalila lecha, to you God, to kill the righteous with the wicked. So Rav Abba bar Kahana says, Amar Avram lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribono shel Olam, Chulin hu me'asot kadavar hazeh la'amid tzadikim rasha. Now, what does Chalila mean in this case? So Rav Abba interprets it to be from the root of Chulin, right? Chulin, which is something that is totally profane and forbidden and other. So he says, Chalila lecha mean it's like Chulin. It's something that is not becoming, not appropriate in any way for you to kill the righteous with the wicked. And then the Gemara says, Velo, is that the case? V'aktiv, it says, Nicheskel v'ichartim imcha tzadik v'rasha. God says that I will destroy both the tzaddik and the rasha together. So the Gemara says, but tzaddik shenu gamur. So the reference in Yechezkel is that God will destroy, the tzaddik and the rasha, but the tzaddik shenu gamur, right? Not the fully righteous tzaddik, just the tzaddik who has some flaws. Aval b'tzaddik gamur lo. But by tzaddik gamur, then God should not destroy them together with the rasha, and that's what Avram was saying. Avram was saying, how could you destroy the tzaddik gamur with the rasha? Whereas Yechezkel is referring to tzaddik shenu gamur. And the Gemara continues and says, V'aktiv, but doesn't it say in Yechezkel, Umimikdashi techelu? So there's a story in Yechezkel Perak Tet, which is actually kind of an important story to learn. We're not going to look at the psukim, but basically the story in Yechezkel Perak Tet, Yechezkel is a vision of 6 men, and then a 7th man who's wearing on his waist a quill that a sofer uses, like a quill kit. And God says to the man with the quill, go around Yerushalayim and write the letter Tav on the head of all the people who are in mourning about all the sins that everybody is committing. And then God says to the other 6 men, now go and kill everyone who doesn't have a sign on their head. So basically mark off the really righteous ones who are in a constant state of mourning over the depravity of the nation, and then kill everybody else. And God says, start from my mikdash. And start from the Beit HaMikdash and go and slaughter everybody there who doesn't have the mark on their head, and then go, and spread out from there. It says, start from my mikdash. But the Gemara here records a tradition of Tani Rav Yosef, Al tikru mikdashi, ela mikudashai. From my holy ones, elu b'nei adam shekimu et Torah me'alef ad taf. So the ones who fulfilled every mitzvah. So in other words, the tzaddik gamur. So here we see that God, the way this is interpreted is God, when he said, mark off the heads of the righteous, who are in constant state of mourning, and then go kill everybody else, and start from my mikdash. So we'll see in a minute the Gemara in Shabbat, which basically says God changed his mind and said, no, even kill the ones who are totally righteous. And we'll see the Gemara which explains it further. But God changes his mind and says, basically kill everybody, even the ones who are the mikudashai, the tzaddik gamur. So we see here that God kills tzaddikim and rashaim. So how do we understand that? So the answer the Gemara gives is Hatam nami keivan shaya bi'adam limchot velo michu havulhu ketzadikim sheinam gemurim. Okay, in that case of the mikudashai, it's true they were tzadikim gemurim, but they didn't do anything to try to stop all the wicked people from sinning. They just sat there and they moaned and they mourned and they said, oh, we live in such a wicked generation. But they didn't do anything to try to give tochacha, rebuke to the people of the generation. So it's as though they were tzaddikim she'enam gemurim, and therefore they merited to be killed. where they deserve to be killed. But if a case of a tzaddik that's gamur, who fulfills the Torah me'alef ataf, and does what is needed to give tochacha to the people around him, that person is who Avram is referring to say le'amit tzaddikim rasha. How could you kill that tzaddik gamur who also gives rebuke when necessary? Okay, so that's what a Gemara in Avodah Zarah Dalet Amud Aleph says. Let's go now to Shabbos, Masechet Shabbat, Nun Hey Amud Aleph, to expand on that drasha that we quote in the name of Rav Yosef. So Amar Rabbi Zer Rabbi Simon. Okay, Lochichinhu Mar Lehani Deberish Galuta. So Rabbi Zer says to Rabbi Simon, go rebuke the people in the house of the Rish Galuta. Right, the Rish Galuta in Bavel was the exilarch. They were kind of the elite. So they were acting inappropriately. So Rav Zera says to Rabbi Simon, go tell them off. Go tell them they're not doing the right thing. Amar le lo mekable minai. He says back to him, what's the point? They won't listen to me. Amar le. So he says back to him, Afal gav de lo mekable lochichin humar. It doesn't matter that they won't listen to your rebuke. You should go rebuke them anyways. Amar Rabbi Acha b'Rabbi Chanina, me'olam lo yatzta midat tova mipi HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'chazar ba l'ra'a chutz midavar zeh. Because we have a teaching, God never said he would do something good and then changed his mind and did something bad, except for once in all of history. What was that one time? Dichtiv. Vayomer Hashem elav, avor betoch ha'ir betoch Yishalayim, v'tvita tav al mitzchot anashim anenachim v'nenakim, ha'im al kol to'evot anasot betocha v'gomer. This is the story in Yechezkel, where God said to the man with the sofer kit, Sofer Stam Kit, go write the letter Tav on the foreheads of everybody who is upset about the state of affairs. Amar lo Kadosh Baruch Hu Gavriel. The Gemara interprets and says, God said to Gavriel that this man with the Sofer Kit was really the angel Gavriel. Lechu Roshoma Mitzchan Shel Tzadikim Tav Shel Dio Shelo Yishletu Bahem Malachei Chabala. Go write the letter Tav out of ink, with ink, on the heads of the righteous, so that they shouldn't be destroyed. But also write a tav out of blood on the heads of the wicked, so that they will be destroyed. Then the trait of harsh judgment, din, midat adin, comes before God and says, why are you? What's the difference between these two groups? So the Hashem says back, these are totally righteous, these are totally wicked. So the totally righteous I'm marking with ink so they shouldn't be destroyed, and the totally wicked I'm marking with blood so they should be destroyed. But Midat Abdin says back to God, biדם limchot velo michu. But the totally righteous, tzadikim gemurim, didn't do anything. They didn't try to stop the totally wicked from sinning. God says to the attribute of din, I know, because I'm God, I know everything. I know that even if the righteous had said to the wicked not to sin and given them tochacha, the wicked wouldn't have listened. And therefore it's not their fault that they didn't rebuke, because it wouldn't have done anything. Amar lefanav, Midat Adin says to God, Ribono shel olam, im lefanecha galui, lehem mi galui. Fine, you might know that, God, but how are the tzaddikim gemurim supposed to know that? In other words, it might be revealed before you, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a responsibility to go and rebuke the people around them, because how are they supposed to know what the outcome will be? V'hainu dichtiv, zaken bachur b'tula taf v'nashim targu l'mashchit, v'al ish asher elav atav al tigashu u'miktashi techelu. Uchtiv v'ayechelu anashim askanim asher lifnei habayit, tani Rav Yosef al tikru miktashi, elu mekudashai, elu b'nei adam shekimu et haTorah kula me'alef ataf. Basically, God changed his mind and said, you're right, I agree with you, Midat Adin. These righteous, these tzaddikim gemurim that didn't stop the rest of the people or didn't give them tochacha, trying to prevent them from sinning, also deserve to die. Therefore, and not only that, start from them. Start from the totally righteous. Start from my holy ones. So we see here that even someone who's never sinned, fulfills the Torah, me'alef ataf, he still deserves, he still has a responsibility to rebuke everybody else. And if he doesn't, then he's as though he was a tzaddik sheino gamor and is deserving of destruction in certain cases. So we see a pretty harsh pronouncement from these Gemaras that the Midat Hadin is right and wins out over Midat HaRachamim in this case. And in a situation where destruction is already going out, only the tzaddikim gemurim who didn't rebuke their fellow people can be saved from destruction. No matter how righteous you are, if you don't have public responsibility and try to rebuke the Amcha around you, then you too can be destroyed when destruction is going out. There's a Gemara in Bava. Go ahead.
That's like the whole story of Yonah is that. Like say for Yonah.
Okay, what do you mean?
Like that Yonah said, what's the point? I don't want to do it. I don't want to save Nineveh. And God said, no, it's your responsibility to like, Yonah said it's not going to help. And then God said, no, if you go, it will help. And he refused, and that's why he had that whole talich of drowning and being with the fish. And
interesting. I would say it's almost the opposite there. Because what happened with Yonah is that God told Yonah to tell the people to repent. Yonah did, and they listened to the rebuke.
Right.
And that's why Yonah was upset. Because Yonah said, I didn't want to go because I knew that they would listen to me and that they would repent and that you would just go back on the evil that you wanted to visit upon them. Here we're saying the opposite. Here we're saying the righteous who don't go don't know what the outcome will be. They have to go, like Yonah had to go.
Right.
Actually, now I confused myself. Maybe it is like Yonah. That Yonah should have gone, right? The fact that God commanded Yonah to go, Yonah should have gone because he had a responsibility to go and rebuke. And the fact that he didn't want to do it was a bad thing. Yeah, okay, so you're right. Sorry, it isn't the opposite. The only difference there is that Nineveh was non-Jews, maybe, and this is talking about Jews. But leaving that aside, I think your point is well taken. That the fact that Yonah did not want to go and save the people around him, that is exactly God's point. Maybe you could have saved them. We'll actually see in a minute. Yeah.
Yonah thought they were going to listen. It's different. Yonah didn't want to go save them because he knew they were going to listen, that he knew they were going to repent, and he knew they were going to come and destroy the Jewish people. This is different. This is people who don't go to rebuke because they think that they won't be listened to.
Right. You're right. It is the opposite. I knew it was the opposite. I confused myself.
I'm with you, Ron.
Thanks, Johnny. Yeah, Yonah didn't want to go because he thought they would listen. Here we're talking about tzaddikim who don't rebuke because they think it's not going to work. Right, exactly. Thank you. Just like the how it opened with the Reish Galuta, where he said, what's the point? They're not going to listen to me, so why would I go rebuke them? And then he says back to him, here's a whole story about how you have to go rebuke anyway, even if you don't think they're going to listen. Because you have a responsibility, and perhaps they will listen. How do you know? Right. Thanks for clarifying. Good question, good clarification. Okay.
All
right. Now this should strike us as a bit strange, right? But let's get into some other Gemaras where it gets a bit more complicated. There's a Gemara in Bava Kama, Daf Samech Amud Aleph, which teaches as follows. Tani Rav Yosef, Mai dichtiv, v'atem lo titz'u ish mipetach beito ad boker. Right, so with Yetziat Mitzrayim, when Makat Bechorot was going out, so, right, everybody had to paint the doorways or whatever, and they said, you have to stay in your home, don't go outside. Why not? Kevan shenitan reshut lamashchit, eno mavchin ben tzadikim l'rashaim. Once destruction is unleashed, there's no differentiation between righteous and wicked. He goes and he kills everybody. Not only that, the destruction starts from the righteous. This is the pasuk from Yechezkel we saw before. God wipes out the tzaddik and the rasha. It says tzaddik and then the rasha. God starts with the tzaddik and then the rasha. But for sure, when destruction has been unleashed, when God has decided that the time has come for destruction, tzaddikim rashayim, it's fair game. Everybody gets killed. Bachi Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef cried, Kula hai nami le'ein domin. So he says, if tzaddikim are going to just get wiped out whenever destruction is visited upon the world, what's the point? These righteous people are just going to get destroyed. They're like nothing. Amalei Abaye says to him, Tivutahu legabayhu. No, this is actually good for them that they get killed off before the Rashaim. Tichtiv, it says in Yeshayahu, Ki mipnei hara'ah ne'asaf hatzadik. That the tzaddik is gathered in before the wickedness comes. In other words, the fact that the tzaddikim are killed before the Rashaim is actually a chesed for them, that they won't see the suffering that's going to be visited upon everyone else. Right? It's like a quick death before they see all the suffering of the world, which would cause them to suffer. So God in His mercy actually causes them to be killed first. That's Abaye's response to Rav Yosef. Okay?
I'm wondering if there's any usefulness in dividing these stories into two categories. You have Mitzrayim, you have before that Sodom, we talked about Nineveh, where it's Gentiles. And then we have Yechezkel, we have Shaya, where it's talking about the Jewish people. So I don't know if there's meant to be any distinction between the cases based on that, or everything's all the same because they're all humans.
Nobody seems to be making any distinctions. They're just drawing psukim from here and there. The story of Mitzrayim, it's talking about the Jews in Egypt, that they can't go outside, because once the mashchit comes, he'll kill everyone.
But the destruction is going to be met on the Egyptians, ultimately.
That's true, yeah. I don't know, we'd have to understand this more closely to see if there's any sort of dividing line between the two, but it seems to me that there doesn't seem to be any sort of difference.
Well, I mean, that's one possible conclusion, which is interesting in and of itself, which would be, you would like to think that this justice is a universal, however crazy it sounds in some of these stories, at least it's even-handed.
What do you mean? Sorry?
Between Jews and Gentiles, that there wouldn't be a double standard.
Oh, right. Meaning that when the mashchit goes out, he kills everybody regardless of if you're Jewish or not Jewish. Yeah, that's what seems to be. Yeah, right, exactly. That's what seems to be said here. Mm-hmm. In other words, that was what Avram was saying about Sdom. Sdom wasn't Jewish, right? And Avram was the only Jew, but conceptually, Avram was saying, how could you kill a tzaddik and rasha? And the Gemara's whole analysis was that Avram was saying only in the case of a tzaddik gamur who warns other people. Otherwise, Avram was that wasn't applicable. The mashchit would go and kill everyone in Sdom. We'll see, actually, if we have time, the Mefarshim, the Maharsha, actually says, but that didn't happen in Sdom, right? That God saved Lot. We'll get to that. Okay, so here we see this idea of a mashchit going out and then killing everybody, right? It doesn't matter if you're righteous or wicked. Good. Let's...
We actually, when we were learning the coronavirus Tzurban Rabbanan, they quoted that as well. That thing about if a mashchit goes out, it doesn't differentiate kind of thing. Because at the time, a lot of the Rabbanim were saying, oh no, you shouldn't close the Batei Midrash and close the Yeshivot, the Batei Knesset, because, our Torah will keep us, healthy, kiviyachol. And that was like a proof against that. Kind of thing.
I didn't read this inside, but I brought it just in case. To your point, Johnny, right? We stopped here somewhere in Bava Kama Daf Samech. So see what it says here. Tanu Rabbanan dever ba'ir knos raglecha. Shneimar v'atem lo tetzu ish mipetach beto al boker. Right? When there's a plague in the city, stay home. It's basically that's what this Braita says. Yeah. So COVID or any other reason, right? And then the parallel is from Yetziat Mitzrayim, right? Which obviously it was very profound that last year Pesach, the night of Pesach, there was a total seger, right? Because that's when it was first starting. No one was allowed to leave their homes Pesach night. It definitely was reminiscent of Matem lo tetzu ish mipetach beto al boker, because there's a mashchit going around, right? The coronavirus was going around, and the mashchit doesn't care if you're a tzaddik or a rasha. It's going to kill everybody. So there's definitely what to say about the relevance in the current times of this whole concept. So yeah, it's a good point.
Well, the thing that's unusual about Makat Bechorot is it wasn't so much tzaddik and rasha, if we, is the Bechor or not Bechor, so there depends on what the criterion is here. It's a little bit of a different case.
Well, within the Bechorot, it's saying maybe it doesn't matter if the Bechor... From the son of Pharaoh to whatever, the lowliest person in Egypt, but regardless of their behavior, if they were an Egyptian Bechor, they were doomed. Right. Doesn't matter if they were tzaddik or rasha. Exactly. Mm-hmm. So it is that's the point. In other words, the mashchit comes, he doesn't care. He's killing all the Bechor. It doesn't make a difference how righteous the person is or not. Okay, let's look at this Iyun Yaakov here. Okay, the Iyun Yaakov in Shabbat Daf Nun Hey, which was the story from Yechezkel. So he says as follows: Man ishtanu elu me'elu. Right, Midat Adin says to God, what's the difference between the righteous and the wicked? Nira le'aniu da'ati de'ita b'shas Avodah Zarah Daf Daled right? It seems based on what it says in Avodah Zarah Daf Adam and Aleph, which is right our sugya, where it says, "Ribbono shel olam chulin hu me'asot kadavar ze la'amid tzadikim rasha velo ve'achtiv v'yichartim mimcha tzadik v'rasha v'tzadik she'enu gamur al kal lashono." So he quotes our Gemara of Abraham's dialogue with God. Ulefi zeh hu adin ibcha rasha she'enu gamur nitzal b'zchut tzadik gamur. And based on what we're seeing here, the Kiyun Yaakov says in our sugya in Shabbat, right, where we say, okay, the tzaddik gamur ended up being the mikudashai, right, the ones that first were attacked by the mashchit, but the tzaddik she'eno gamur perhaps could be saved by the tzaddikim. So we see that tzaddik gamur is the first one who's attacked, but the tzaddik she'eno gamur perhaps could be saved. How does that make any sense? So we'll say, v'im ken yesh lomar, the Kiyun Yaakov says as follows, shezeh shesha'al man ishtanu elu me'elu, that the Midat Adin says, what's the difference between these two groups? Ve'eshiv, and God responds, halalu tzadikim gemurim, v'halalu rashaim gemurim. If we go back to Gemara, God says, these are totally righteous, these are totally wicked. V'lo tzadikim she'enam gemurim, v'lo rashaim she'enam gemurim. It specifies totally righteous and totally wicked, and not righteous that are not totally righteous, or wicked that are not totally wicked. So the Yaakov says that that's on purpose. Right, and so it's good then that the Midat Adin goes and says what continues the attack and says, but the tzaddikim gemurim could have protested, right? Because he says why? Shaya lo limchot bishloma I ayri berashaim she'enam gemurim. Right? If the Rashayim were not totally wicked, yesh lomar delakach lo micha bahem. We can explain that that's why the tzaddik, if the Rashayim were not totally wicked, the tzaddikim gemurim would have had a valid excuse for why they didn't try to rebuke them. Why? De ulai lo yitzaitu, because maybe the Rashayim she'enam gemurim wouldn't have listened to the tzaddikim gemurim. Umutav shiyu shogegim ve'al yu mezidim. Kedeita b'shas debeitza perek hamevi. That there's a principle, mutav shiyu shogegim ve'al yu mezidim. In a case where somebody's not going to listen to rebuke, you shouldn't rebuke them, because it's best for them to be shogegin than to be mezidin. It's better for you not to warn them, and then to do it as a shogeg, than for you to warn them, for them to ignore you, and then for them to be liable with the warning you gave them. So there's this principle of better to be shogin and not mezidin. So the Kiyun Yaakov says, okay, based on this principle, if the Rashayim were not gemurim, then the tzaddikim gemurim could have said, that's why we didn't rebuke them, because we figured they wouldn't listen, and then we would just make them mezidin. We didn't want to do that. Okay? Masha'en ken b'Rashayim gemurim, which is not the case by Rashayim gemurim. Amrinan le'efech hal ituhu l'rasha v'yamot. That when it comes to someone who's completely and totally wicked, we have this principle of let them be wicked and die. In other words, there isn't this concept of shushug again value mezidin. If they're totally wicked, then you should pack on the wickedness. Right, so the tzaddikim gemurim would have no excuse of saying, why didn't you rebuke the Rashayim gemurim? Because maybe they would have done tshuva, which is good. But even if they didn't, if they wouldn't have done tshuva because the Rashayim gemurim, so it's good that you rebuke them and turn them from shogeg to amazed. Let them be amazed because they're so wicked. Okay, that's what the Kiyun Yaakov says. So that's why it specifies the Rashayim gemurim and not Rashayim she'enam gemurim. V'chein, and similarly, I ma'ir b'tzaddikim she'enam gemurim, and if the righteous group had been tzaddikim she'enam gemurim, haiti omer mishum hachi en sipek biadam limchot. If the tzaddikim had been not totally righteous, then I could have said that maybe they shouldn't have warned. Because you only tzaddikim gemurim have the right to be mochiach other people. If you're a tzaddik she'eno gamur, you can't be mochiach, perhaps, because then you're not a tzaddik gamur, so who gives you the right to be mochiach? I think that's what that means. Blah, blah, blah. Masha'en ken, achshav, shemayu mitzadikim gemurim v'Hashem gemurim, shapir kitreg, shaya lehem limchot. So when the Hashem says tzadikim gemurim and Hashem gemurim, That's why Midat Hadin can come back and say, why didn't the Tzaddikim Gemurim rebuke the Rashayim Gemurim? And God says, you're right, and they actually should be destroyed as well because they didn't rebuke. So the Yon Yaakov is being very specific here and saying it's Dafka Tzaddikim Gemurim Rashayim Gemurim that the Midat Hadin had what to argue. Because if it was either Tzaddikim Shena Gemurim or Rashayim Shena Gemurim, then there would have been a valid excuse why they couldn't have rebuked the other, why the Tzaddikim couldn't have rebuked the Rashayim. So that's how the Yon Yaakov tries to analyze and understand this. But what I'd like to take away from this is that there's this new principle that we haven't encountered yet of Shiyu Shogegin Ve'al Yu Mezidin. That perhaps you shouldn't rebuke because it's best if they don't listen, you've done harm by rebuking them. If they don't listen and do it anyway, you've turned them into Mezidin instead of Shogegim, and that's not good. So how do I understand the relationship between this principle of Yu Shogegin Ve'al Yu Mezidin with all the Gemaras we've seen until now, which basically say Tzaddikim Gemurim who didn't rebuke deserve to be destroyed and not saved from the Mashchit, who was not Mafrid ben Tzaddik and Ra. If only they'd rebuked, then that should have happened. So Tosfot asks this question on our Gemara and says, V'had de'amrinam b'sof cheskat batim, it says in Bava Batra, mutav shiyu shogegin v'ayu mezidin. So hainu b'davar shiadua shelo yikablu im yimchu. So Tosfot says, no, you're talking about two different groups. Tosfot says, when the tzaddikim gemurim know that the Rashayim gemurim will not listen, then the principle of mutav shishogin v'ayu mezidin applies. That's not what all the Gemaras that we've been learning are dealing with. The story in Shabbat and the story of Avram, where it says, Shaya Biדם Limchot v'lo Michu, Havulu ketzadikim shen gemurim, that's in a case where the Rashayim would have potentially accepted the rebuke had it been given to them. But if the Rashayim, it's known that they will not accept the rebuke, then Tzaddikim Gemurim do not have to rebuke, and that's not the case of the Mashchid Eno Mavchin Ben Tzaddik l'Rasha. I didn't bring it here, but the Ran asks on this sugya, he says, how are you supposed to know? No, he rejects this Tosfot. He says, what do you mean? B'davar she'adua shelo yikablu im yimchu. Like, in the Gemara in Shabbat, it puts that in the mouth of God. Midat Hadin says, God, you might know, but how is a tzaddik supposed to know that? How can we ever know if someone will accept rebuke? Perhaps if it's said in the right way, they will accept. So how do you make this differentiation? But leave that as it may, that's how Tosfot tries to resolve this principle of not rebuking with the principle of not only should you rebuke, but if you don't rebuke, then you are as though you were tzaddik she'eno gamur, and you are deserving not only of being destroyed, but being destroyed first. Right? So it's a very strong distinction, and there's nuances here that, like I said at the beginning of the shiur, I don't fully grasp the differences between the different applications, but I do want to bring these different Gemaras. The main takeaway behind this sugya that I think is, leaving aside all of the theological questions around the tzaddik varalo and being punished without a fair case, etc., the point that I want to take away is this idea of public responsibility, right? What is the achrayut on tzaddikim to rebuke the people in their society when they see something that's going wrong, right? Famously with Noach, we know that classically the Midrashim say the ark wasn't just a literal ark, but it was a metaphorical closing off. That Noach matzachen ben Hashem, but he just saved himself. He didn't do anything to save others. And Avraham, in contrast, was one who went out of his way to be an nefesh aser asu b'charan and convert other people, etc., etc. Right? What is the responsibility of a tzaddik to go out and protest actively and try to bring people back to do tshuva? So it seems from the Gemara that we've seen that in general, not only does a tzaddik gamur have a responsibility to give tochacha to everybody else, but he's perhaps the only one who can do it, as the Yon Yaakov said, because tzaddik sheino gamur might not be allowed to give tochacha because he himself is not in a state to do that. So only a tzaddik gamur can give tochacha. He has a requirement to give the tochacha. But more than that, if he doesn't, he's considered, that is in and of itself, that removes him from a tzaddik gamur and de-promotes him to a tzaddik she'eno gamur. And then he's liable when destruction comes to be destroyed. So it's certainly the responsibility of a tzaddik to come and give tochacha in places where it's required. But that, according to Tosfot, is only in a scenario where there's a slight, no matter how small, but some chance that the Rasha will listen. If he's a Rasha Gamur, according to the Yaakov, or even if perhaps he's a Rasha She'eno Gamur, but there's no chance that he'll listen, then that wouldn't apply, and we would say it's best Shiu Shogegin V'Hayu Mezidin, it's best not to rebuke. How to know when to rebuke, when not to rebuke, what the right scenario is, as we said, something that isn't necessarily so clear, but there's a lot riding on it, right? The mashchit, if he comes, that is the only thing that can save a tzaddik, is rebuking the right people in the right situations. There was one other thing that I wanted to look at, even though we're a bit over time, I'll try to do it really quickly. The Chidushei Gaonim asks a question on our sugya in Avodah Zarah, where right, Avram said, Chalila l'cha, and then Rabbi Bakana says that means chulin, right? So the Chidushei Gaonim says right, that the Maharsha, which we won't read inside, asked, why do I need what is the connection between Rav Abba Bar Kahana's drasha of what does Chalila mean? Chalila means chulin, right? And therefore, it's a contradiction from Vichratim Imcha Tzadik V'Rasha. I don't need the whole drasha of chulin, right? I could just come and say, there's a pasuk of Avraham who says, Chalila L'cha Me'asot Tzadikim Rasha, and say, but there's another pasuk which says, V'Ichratim Imcha Tzadik V'Rasha, and there's a contradiction between Avraham saying Chalila L'cha to kill Tzadikim Rashim together, and Yechezkel says that God does kill Tzadikim Rashim together. Why do I tie that to this idea of chulin hu, of this drasha of Rav Abba Kahana, which doesn't seem to be related to the stira that you can bring between Avraham and Yechezkel? So basically the Chidushei Gaonim proposes V'nei le'nei yadaiti l'taretz Tinei Rashi b'Parsha Mishpatim b'kar d'nakiv tzadik at harog. Rashi in Parsha Mishpatim on the pasuk that you should not kill those who are clean and righteous. Diachol yatzam mibeitin zakai v'ar'u chov shiachziru oto Talmud loma tzadik at harog v'zeh kfar tzadik yatzam mipi beitin. That there's a halacha. Let's say somebody is in front of a court. The court declares him innocent. After the fact, more evidence is found that he actually was guilty. So maybe in a modern day scenario, there's DNA testing or security footage or something that actually was guilty. The halacha is, once Beit Din declared him innocent, he's innocent. You can't go and reverse the ruling. Because he went out of Beit Din Tzadik, but Tzadik atal rog. When it comes to capital cases, that's the rule. Kilo atzadik rashach darbed shluchim nokom ayin sham b'shinuyim sham blah blah blah. Hayotze mizeh shematzinu tzadik lifamim kshehu tzadik b'nei habriot. So the Chidushei Gaonim says that means we have a category of a person who is a tzaddik in the eyes of man, right? In the eyes of his fellow man, he's considered a tzaddik. Ulefi zeh atishapir debelav had chulin hulecha lo avekasha kraya hadadi. And so the Chidushei Gaonim says that's why this question makes sense. That's how we can understand why we need the chulin piece. Because if I didn't have the chulin piece, I just had the chalila lecha, so there wouldn't be a contradiction between Avram saying chalila lecha to kill tzaddik and rasha, and Yechezkel saying that you killed tzaddik and rasha together. Why? Diyesh lomar the kravi chratim imcha tzaddik v'rasha hainu tzaddik b'nei habriot af shu chayav bedin Hashem yitbarach. That you could answer and say, no, the pasuk in Yechezkel, when it says God kills the tzaddik and the rasha together, that's talking about when he's a tzaddik only in the eyes of man. But in the eyes of God, he's actually not a tzaddik. And then I understand why God kills them both. But when it comes to but when it comes to the Chalila, where Avram says, how could you kill tzaddik and rasha together? That's talking about a case where it's Chalila in the eyes of man only. And so then it's not a contradiction. Aval hashta de mefarish Chalila chulin hulecha. But when we explain Chalila to mean chulin, meaning it's a totally inappropriate for God to do this sort of thing, kasher shapir de lashon Chalila mashma she'avel hu negdo yitbarach v'zeu b'tzadik bedin Hashem yitbarach aval b'tzadik b'nei habriot v'chayev bedin Hashem yitbarach shaz enenu avel b'cheko yitbarach kevan shu chayav bedino v'lo sheach lomar Chalila lecha me'asod zeh. Okay, he goes on and goes on. Basically, let's summarize it because it's long and we're running out of time. The Chidush Geonim says as follows. He says, once we say chulin, right? That once we say that the interpretation chulin hu lecha, that means that it's something that is totally unacceptable to God, and that would include even if people think that the person was righteous. That's what the Chidush Geonim says. In other words, chalila lecha originally means in the Beit Din Shel Mala in terms of what is actually just in the objective sense. So Avram is saying, how could you ever kill like the tzaddik that's actually a tzaddik? But if yichirtim mimcha tzaddik v'rasha, that's fine because it could be a tzaddik who's only a tzaddik in the eyes of the people, but God knows he's really not a tzaddik. So there's no contradiction. Because it's not a shofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat, like Avram says, in a case where it's a tzaddik just in the eyes of people, but God actually knows that he's not a tzaddik. That's fine then. But if you interpret it to be chulin hu lecha, then you're saying it's not just about, it's chulin, meaning even the chilul Hashem is a player here. How could God go and kill someone, even if objectively he's not a tzaddik, but if everybody thinks he's a tzaddik, then God killing him is still something that is a shofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat, claims the Chidush Geonim. So it's almost as if kiviyachol God's hands are tied in a situation where a person is not a tzaddik, but everyone thinks he's a tzaddik. God almost, according to this, has to relate to him as a tzaddik, because if he kills him, then that's a chilul Hashem, because the people think that he's a tzaddik. So, yeah, he goes on and he dives into this a bit more, but that's kind of one idea that the Chidush Geonim tries to be medayek in our sugya of Avodah Zarah on Daf Daled. So I know we discussed a lot of things here, and there's a lot of open questions and maybe some loose strands, but there's some interesting Gemaras about the responsibility of a person klapei the people around him when he sees something wrong. When should you protest? When should you not protest? When are you forbidden from protesting? These are all very important questions to ask. And then we also touched on some, larger theological questions about, when is a person totally protected versus when are there situations when sometimes there's just destruction and it doesn't matter what a person's particular zchuyot are, that the mashchid is eino mavchin ben tov l'ra, and that's just the situation like in Yechezkel or in Yetziat Mitzrayim. Questions? Shkoyach.
Shkoyach.
Shkoyach.